What if Luffy, Law, and Kid swapped destinations after Wano? In the canon story, Luffy went to Egghead, Law went to Winter Island, and Kid went to Elbaf. But what if we switch their paths? Today, we're breaking down 6 alternate scenarios, 2 for each captain. We'll cover what happens if Law takes the middle path to Elbaf or the southeast path to Egghead. Then, we'll do the same for Kid. After that, we'll see Luffy versus Blackbeard at Winter Island. And finally, we'll get to the one you're all waiting for. What happens if Luffy went to Elbaf immediately after Wano? As you know, Elbaf is where Shanks is. Oh, believe me, this is not going to be the happy reunion you think. Just keep watching and you'll see what I mean. Make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. And with all that said, let's get into it. All right, first up, let's talk about Law. In the canon, Law went northeast and ended up at Winter Island, where he ran into Blackbeard. And as we all know, that didn't go so well. Law just barely managed to escape alive thanks to Beppo going Sulong via Chopper's Rumble Ball. But what if he had gone to Elbaf instead? At Elbaf, you have Shanks and the Red Hair Pirates, who are even stronger than the current Blackbeard Pirates, plus Dory, Broggy, and the Giant Warrior Pirates. However, Law is not Captain Eustace Mid. He's not looking to throw hands with a Yonko just for the sake of it. Once his submarine enters Elbaf's waters and gets flagged by Shanks' fleet, Law would obviously lead with diplomacy. And honestly, Shanks would have no problem letting the Heart Pirates dock to let their log pose reset. While Elbaf and Shanks are allies, it isn't strictly Shanks' territory, so as long as the Heart Pirates aren't hostile, they're safe from the Red Hair Pirates. The real problem here would be the Giants themselves, who don't like outsiders. But think about it this way, if Law isn't hostile, and the Giants learn that he's the one who took down Big Mom, their sworn enemy, they would treat him like a hero. Not to mention, Law is already acquainted with Hajrudin because of the events in Dressrosa. Ultimately, Law has nothing to worry about in Elbaf. He'd most likely just end up sitting around, getting annoyed as Shanks constantly annoys him with questions about what Luffy was like when they were traveling together. He'd talk about all the things Luffy put him through, and Shanks and everyone would be laughing their asses off as they constantly ask Law, and then what happened? Basically, compared to Winter Island, this path is easy mode for the Heart Pirates. Now, let's take a look at the second scenario. What if Law went to Egghead? On paper, this is easily the worst route of the 3. As we saw in the canon, the Straw Hats had to deal with CP0, the Seraphim, Admiral Kizaru, and eventually the 5 Elders themselves. While Law could potentially take down Lucci, the Heart Pirates would obviously be overwhelmed by the Seraphim, and Kizaru is quite literally a game over. However, the Heart Pirates operate differently than the Straw Hats. They aren't as likely to get deeply entangled in Vegapunk's mess unless they have to, and if they do, Law has much smarter ways to play the game. Let's see how it goes. It starts with the rescue of Bonnie. Saving her from drowning would be simple because Law has a submarine, and then while the Sea Beast weapon would still pose a threat, Law could use Room to teleport his entire crew and the sub directly onto the island, and then he can also use Room to bypass the Lava Phase's laser dome. This changes the entire dynamic of the arc. Once Law reaches Shaka, the #1 Vegapunk satellite would immediately see the tactical value of Law's op fruit abilities, and he would decide to cut a deal with Law to be transported off Egghead in exchange for sharing everything he knows about the Will of D. This will be a crazy bargaining chip, considering how uncovering the meaning of the D is Law's main goal at this point in the story. From that moment on, Law would naturally keep Shaka in his sights to make sure his investment is safe, which in turn prevents York from getting the opportunity to shoot Shaka, and so the traitor wouldn't be discovered until much later. However, the group is still technically cooked. The world government is fully intent on killing Vegapunk regardless of whether Luffy is there or not, which means CP0 and then Kizaru and Saturn are still closing in on the island. So, how would this even go? The situation would inevitably escalate to the point where CP0, Kizaru, Saturn, and all the Vice Admirals have arrived on Egghead. By this time, Bonnie would have also seen Kuma's memories, and so Vegapunk's main body would fully lock in on making sure she survives, even if it means using himself as bait. To be fair, Vegapunk already knows he needed to die because of the note he left for himself before he removed his memories. Although, Luffy's arrival in the canon story made him think he could actually escape now that he had an Emperor of the Sea on his side. Law's arrival wouldn't give him that same level of assurance. He'll use himself as bait and get killed by Kizaru, and his death would trigger the global broadcast just like in the original story. Then, while Kizaru is mentally nerfed by the guilt of killing his friend, and Saturn is busy summoning the other elders to frantically hunt for the Dendenmushi, Law would have the perfect window to slip away with Shaka, Bonnie, and potentially other satellites like Lilith or Edison safely inside the submarine. They could quickly hit the depths of the sea and start traveling toward Elbaf, where Shaka would handle the diplomacy with the Giants. Of course, taking this path means many key events would never happen. For example, the Iron Giant Emeth would never awaken because there's no Gear 5 and therefore no Drums of Liberation. And since the Elders, the Marines, and also York would all be focused on locating the source of the transmission. They would find the Dendenmushi inside the Iron Giant much sooner. They would stop the broadcast before Vegapunk delivers his iconic words, "The fate of the world depends on whoever claims the One Piece." Even so, this is a big W for Law, as he survives the most dangerous island in the world and escapes with both Bonnie and at least one Vegapunk satellite. But what about Kid? For our third scenario, let's talk about what if, instead of heading to Elbaf and getting completely destroyed by Shanks, Kid had gone to Winter Island. He'd have to fight the Blackbeard pirates. So, does he have any bit of a chance? First, we have to look at the lineup of the Blackbeard pirates. When Teach fought Law, we saw that he only brought Burgess, Van Augur, Doc Hugh, and Stronger. Kid, on the other hand, would have his entire crew with him. But if we're being honest, Killer is really the only relevant fighter on that team. But anyway, let's see how this battle between the Kid pirates and the Blackbeard pirates for the winner-takes-all poneglyphs would go. If we assume that Killer takes on Burgess, that leaves Doc Hugh, Stronger, and Van Augur to deal with the rest of the Kid pirates. Unfortunately, the rest of Kid's crew isn't very impressive, and I bet Van Augur could easily solo them from a distance. Honestly, the fodder members of the Kid pirates might put up an even worse fight than the Heart pirates did. At least Law's crew was used to fighting in the water, which gave them a slight field advantage. But the Kid pirates are genuinely just going to be free XP points for the Blackbeard pirates. Ultimately, however, it all comes down to Kid versus Blackbeard. And how do you think this is gonna go? Kid possesses Conqueror's Haki and a Devil Fruit Awakening, and while he gets slandered as Captain Mid, he is definitely not weak. He is in the same tier as Elbaf Zoro, but the problem is that Kid relies on his fruit just as much as Law does. If Blackbeard uses the Black Vortex to pull him in and then nullifies Kid's Devil Fruit, it would leave him vulnerable. And while Kid's raw physical strength and Haki may allow him to land a critical blow in that opening, he won't be able to win. He does not even have advanced Armament Haki, let alone advanced Conqueror's Haki, which means this path is an L for Kid. But it would be a respectful L. He'd actually get to put up a fight, which is obviously a step up from being deleted in one shot by Shanks. Alright, time for the fourth scenario. What if instead of heading to Elbaf, Kid went to Egghead? This is actually not a bad route for Kid. As we all know, Egghead is the future island, which means it's packed with advanced technology, robots, lasers, and most importantly, crazy amounts of metal. You see where this is going, right? This is arguably the best possible route for Kid because he would have the ultimate battlefield advantage. By leveraging his Magnet Fruit Awakening, he could essentially turn the entire island into a weapon. We're talking about a version of Damned Punk with an attack potency that could rival Loki's Thorhide. He could potentially even pilot the Iron Giant Emeth like a mecha. And who knows, maybe Atlas can also help him weaponize the Mother Flame as ammo. Let's walk through how this plays out. The Kid pirates close in on Egghead, but unfortunately, they don't notice Bonnie's screams and miss the chance to save her. Fortunately, for the sake of the story, let's just assume Bonnie conveniently washes up on a nearby island and survives anyway. Now, once the Kid pirates arrive at Egghead, would it be possible for Vegapunk to cut a deal with him like he did with Law? To be fair, there are theories that Kid might actually be a Vegapunk satellite because of the 07 on his railgun, but the context Oda gave us in the SBS of Volume 104 makes this seem unlikely. I mean, now we know Kid, Killer, Heat, and Wire were gang bosses in the South Blue before Kid unified them. The timeline just doesn't match up for him to be a Vegapunk satellite. But even if Kid and Vegapunk aren't related, a deal is still very much on the table. Vegapunk could offer Kid technological upgrades for his ship, the Victoria Punk, and even teach him how to use his Magnet Fruit more effectively. Plus, for Kid, who is likely frustrated that Luffy became an emperor before him, the chance to capture the world's greatest genius would be very tempting. Alright, things begin, the CP0 arrives, but Kid should be able to defeat Lucci relatively easily. He is in a similar power tier to Zoro, plus on Egghead, he has a battlefield advantage. Meanwhile, Killer is more than capable of handling Kaku. The momentum only shifts once Kizaru arrives, because in a direct one-on-one fight, Kid would get absolutely destroyed by an admiral. But just like in the Law scenario, Vegapunk's main body could act as bait to ensure the others survive. Then from here, the story could go in two ways. In the first version, Kid and the Vegapunk satellites escape under the cover of the global broadcast, while Saturn is distracted. With Stussy and the other satellites serving as a diversion, Kid could go ham on the surrounding marine fleet to clear the way. I mean, with the sheer amount of metal that's on Egghead, Kid could even recreate Douglas Bullet's feat by becoming an island-sized mecha. Plus, even if one or two elders pursue him while the others search for the Dendenmushi, Kid can stall them from a distance with long-ranged weapons. And once his ship escapes far enough, they wouldn't be able to pursue him any longer. After all, considering how Mars was forced to return to Mary Joie after getting yeeted by Luffy Team Rocket style, it's clear they can't stray too far away from Saturn's summoning circle, or they'll be pulled back to Mary Joie. Now, they can send Kizaru after Kid, but as we learned in the SBS of Volume 110, where it's hinted Kizaru was the one who fed Luffy, Kizaru was having many second thoughts. So who knows? He he might just look the other way and let the kid pirates flee with one of the satellites. And speaking of the satellites, which satellites would escape with him? I'd say it'll most likely be Edison or Lilith. The reason we're looking at these two specifically is that unlike the Law scenario, Shaka gets shot in the head by York just like he was shot in the canon. Pythagoras and Atlas are the type who'd use themselves as bait, which leaves us with Edison and Lilith. Edison is the ideal satellite as he'd be the one most intrigued by Kid's magnetic powers. Alternatively, Lilith's evil persona matches Kid's aggressive energy, so they could have an interesting dynamic. But overall, this is just one of the two possibilities for Kid. There is a darker and perhaps more probable possibility. If the Kid pirates haven't escaped by the time the elders stop the broadcast, the Gorosei would jump them. They would capture the crew and publicly execute Captain Eustace Kid after framing him for the murder of Vegapunk. They'd also blame the global broadcast on Kid's terrorism. So, what do you think? Which of the two possibilities is more likely? Alright, so that's all for Kid, which means it's time for today's fifth scenario. What if Luffy and the Straw Hats went to Winter Island? How exactly would a fight with Blackbeard go? Honestly, it's hilarious just how unfair this matchup would be for the Blackbeard pirates. I mean, the power gap is so big that Blackbeard, who's a coward whenever things aren't in his favor, may even decide to sit this one out and flee before the fighting even starts. Again, Blackbeard only brought Burgess, Van Augur, Doc Q, and Stronger. Meanwhile, Luffy would have his entire crew. Zoro and Sanji are now well above Yonko First Commander level. Then you have Jinbei, Frankie, and Robin, who are all at least above Toby Roppo level. Nami can pull off the same level of attack potency as Zoro and Sanji thanks to Zeus. And Monster Point Chopper was strong enough to stall an all-star like Queen. Plus, Brook is the GOAT, which really means Usopp is our only liability, though even he can be pretty clutch when he needs to be. On the other hand, the Blackbeard pirates have such inconsistent scaling that even Sulong Beppo was able to knock them back. Exactly, the Straw Hats would destroy them. To start, Zoro would absolutely dog-walk Burgess. There's simply no way Burgess is stronger than Lucci, whom Zoro was able to defeat relatively easily. Meanwhile, Chopper and Brook could team up to handle Doc Q when stronger. Brook is a perfect counter to Doc Q, because as someone who is literally just skull and bones, he's immune to diseases. And Chopper is also a doctor, which makes him a thematic matchup for Doc Q, and this battle would be over quick. Brook could leverage his immunity to close the distance, and then use his soul-based freezing attacks to lock Stronger in place. Then once Doc Q is vulnerable, Chopper could easily one-shot him and Monster Point. That leaves Van Augur, who is admittedly a tricky opponent due to his warp abilities and sniping. But no need to worry, because we aren't relying on Usopp for this one. Instead, we can leave Van Augur to Sanji, whose speed and observation hockey make him a good counter. Robin is also a great option here, as she could simply sprout her hands directly onto Van Augur and choke him out. As for Blackbeard himself, Luffy would be locked in from the start, considering their history and the fact that Teach is directly responsible for Ace's capture. And Luffy may not even need Gear 5 here. I mean, his advanced Conqueror's hockey is in the same tier as Kaido's. So even if Blackbeard manages to catch Luffy in a black vortex to nullify his rubber powers, Luffy's base physical strength combined with his hockey would be more than enough to defeat him. And let's not forget Jinbei. I mean, every single member of the Blackbeard pirates present is a Devil Fruit user, and Winter Island is essentially a rock surrounded by water. So there's also the possibility that Jinbei simply solos them all by himself. All he has to do is sink their ship to knock them overboard, and the fight is over before it even begins. Ultimately, the Blackbeard pirates would be utterly crushed, and they'd be lucky to escape in the same way Law and Beppo did in the original manga. The Straw Hats could then peacefully wait for their log post to reset while looking over Blackbeard's road poneglyphs. Though at that point, the only one they'd still need is the one held by the man marked by flames. And obviously, Blackbeard doesn't have that one. Alright, finally, it's time to talk about the sixth and also the most anticipated scenario. What happens if Luffy goes to Elbaf? As I teased at the beginning, it's not the happy reunion you'd be expecting. Just keep listening, and you'll see what I mean. Here's how it's going to go. The Straw Hats reach the waters of Elbaf and get incredibly excited as they realize where they are. Luffy and Usopp start cheering at the top of their lungs. And what's funny about this is that it'd be before they realize who and what is on the island. Luffy has no idea that Shanks is right there, and Usopp also has no idea that Yasopp is right there. And obviously, Robin doesn't have any clue that Saul is actually alive and on the island. Now, as they got closer, they'd be noticed by Shanks' fleet of weaker pirate crews that he keeps under his protection. Once they spot the Straw Hat flag and realize an emperor has arrived, the news would fly back to the Red Hair pirates. And while the crew might be hyped to see Luffy, and Yasopp is Well, being Yasopp, the real question is Shanks ready? We know Shanks visited Elbaf around this time to talk to Gaban about Luffy and reunite with his old friends Dory and Broggy. He was even excited enough to tell Gaban's son Colin to remember Luffy's name. But let's not forget that back in Wano, when he had the chance to step onto the island and see Luffy, he brushed it off. Instead, he started talking about Bartolomeo, Luffy's subordinate, and how they needed to deal with him first. And so, because this is the same Luffy that Shanks refused to see on Wano, Shanks would decide it's still too early for their meeting. He'd send Rockstar, the intermediary, to inform the Straw Hats that the Red Hair Pirates are actually on their way out. Basically, he'd tell them to dock at a different port or wait until after they've left. And since this is Emperor-to-Emperor communication, using a messenger makes sense. But would Luffy actually agree to this? Would he just sit on his ship while Shanks sails away? You see, when it comes to Shanks, Luffy is not stupid. Even if the other Straw Hats overreact, he would understand Shanks' intention, that he hasn't yet become the great pirate he promised he'd become. However, before the messenger leaves, Zoro speaks up. Come on, your captain helped ours survive the war at Marineford. At least let us meet him. We want to thank him in person, he says with a cold expression on his face. In response, Rockstar glares at them. He reminds them exactly what Bartolomeo did to their flag and tells them they should be grateful the Red Hair Pirates haven't already turned hostile. The Straw Hats are completely taken aback by this revelation. They obviously had no idea what Bartolomeo was up to. So, what's next? Now that they know, they definitely have to see the Red Hair Pirates, which is why Zoro tells Rockstar that this is all the more reason for them to talk in person. And you know what? Even though Luffy was quiet up until this point, he agrees with Zoro, and he tells Jinbei to continue onwards. Rockstar hurries ahead. He tells the fleet that whatever they do, don't shoot at the Straw Hats. And then he goes to tell Shanks and the Red Hair Pirates that the Straw Hats are coming, and how he also brought up the Bartolomeo incident. Hearing this, Shanks grins and tells his crew to get ready. The Straw Hats dock, and while the Red Hair Pirates are inside Ida's bar, Dory and Broggy are outside, so the Straw Hats have a happy, goofy reunion with them. But then, the Red Hair Pirates, followed by Shanks, step out of the bar. At first, there will be silence. Usopp's eyes meet with Yasopp, but his bum-ass dad just shifts his gaze. Then, while both Luffy and Shanks keep a nonchalant look on their faces, the tension starts to rise as Ben Beckman, Lucky Roo, and Yasopp step forward. To match them, Zoro, Sanji, Jinbei, and Robin step forward as well. A heavy silence falls over the group and lasts for quite a while, until it's finally broken by Jinbei. He starts by thanking the Red Hair Pirates for their help back in Marineford, and then on behalf of Emperor Luffy, he formally apologizes for what Bartolomeo did. He asks them to excuse Bartolomeo's actions, and makes it clear that the Straw Hats don't want any hostility. In response to this, Ben Beckman speaks up. He explains that by burning the Red Hair Pirates flag and replacing it with the Straw Hat flag, Bartolomeo signaled to the world that the Straw Hats were seizing one of Shanks' territories in the New World. Yasopp then adds that this was a direct, hostile challenge. He points out that if they don't respond to it, it would weaken Shanks' reputation and put the safety of the civilians under his protection at risk. Now, it's the Straw Hats' turn to respond. They all know that Luffy doesn't want any aggression, and since Shanks is an emperor, it's best to solve this diplomatically, especially given Luffy's history with Shanks. And conveniently, this is where Robin comes up with an idea. She realizes they can use copies of their road poneglyph rubbings as a peace offering, but she knows she has to be cautious about how she plays that card. So, she proposes a Davy Back fight. The Red Hair Pirates are intrigued, but of course, they aren't interested in taking any of the Straw Hat crew members or their Jolly Roger. And that's when Robin adds the stakes. If the Red Hair Pirates win, the Straw Hats will give them copies of their road poneglyphs. But if the Straw Hats win, the Bartolomeo incident is officially settled and forgiven. Hearing this, as Shanks and Luffy both share a grin, the conditions are accepted, and the Davy Back fight begins. The first round of the Davy Back fight is a small boat race through Elbaf's coastline. On one side, you have Nami and Jinbei, and on the other, you have Building Snake and Hongo. Now, even though Nami and Jinbei are about as skilled as it gets, they simply aren't used to the local waters of Elbaf. Meanwhile, Building Snake is the Red Hair Pirates' veteran navigator, so because of that field advantage, as well as the Straw Hats do, they unfortunately lose the first round. For the second round, things get even more intense with a swordsmanship duel between Zoro and Ben Beckman. Although Zoro is insanely strong, Ben Beckman is most likely Admiral level. We saw proof of this back in Marineford when Kizaru chose not to engage with him, even though Kizaru had no problem fighting Marco and Whitebeard. Plus, Shanks and Beckman seem to have a dynamic similar to Roger and Rayleigh, which suggests Beckman is likely relative to Shanks himself, just like how Rayleigh was relative to Roger. And while Zoro will eventually be relative to Luffy the same way, he isn't quite there yet right after Wano. So, although he definitely does well, he ends up losing the duel. This puts the Straw Hats in a bad spot. They have to win both the third and fourth rounds just to even the score. Otherwise, it's already game over. Conveniently, the third round is a monster hunt involving Sanji and Chopper against Lucky Roo and Monster the Monkey. The goal is to bring back the largest beast they can find from Elbaf's forest within 1 hour. And although Lucky Roo and Monster are already familiar with the forest and know exactly what they're looking for, Sanji and Chopper are basically the two best guys for this kind of competition. They somehow manage to bag the W. And moving on to the fourth round, we have a music contest between Brook and Gap. And as you can expect, the Soul King takes the W. So with that, their score is finally tied. This means everything depends on the fifth and final round, which is a sniping duel between Usopp and Yasopp. As the father and son take their positions, the red hair pirates start yelling at Yasopp. They tell him not to go easy on his son, and he tells them, of course, and insists that he won't go easy on anyone, no matter who the opponent is. However, he starts repeating this to himself so much that he begins to overthink the shot. Meanwhile, Usopp is completely locked in, maybe even more than he was when he shot Sugar back in Dressrosa. Elbaf is his dream. He's up against his father, and his entire crew's reputation is on the line. As nervous as he is, he couldn't have asked for a better way to prove himself. Both of them take the shot at the exact same time. Usopp's lands perfectly in the middle of the target on an absolutely huge tree several dozen kilometers away, while Yasopp's shot lands just a few centimeters below the center. It looks like his mind was so preoccupied with trying not to go easy that he ended up overthinking it and missed the mark. Ultimately, with Bartolomeo's transgression finally forgiven, an absolutely crazy party breaks out. Frankie brings out the Coke and everyone parties. And by everyone, I mean the Straw Hats, the Red Hair Pirates, the Giants, and even Shanks' entire fleet. Robin also gets her big moment as Saul is revealed to be alive. Finally, at the very end of the party, as Shanks and Luffy find themselves alone, Luffy takes off the straw hat and hands it back to Shanks to fulfill the promise he made 12 years ago. And Shanks actually takes it back. Just like that, the Straw Hat Pirates become the Hatless Pirates, and the rest, as they say, is history. No, I'm just kidding. While it looks like Shanks is taking it back for a second, he just laughs and places it right back on Luffy's head. He tells Luffy that he isn't giving it back as a promise or a keepsake this time. He's giving it to him because Luffy has finally become the great pirate he said he would be. Thanks for watching the video. Make sure to like and subscribe, and click on this video next for more great anime content. Go on, check it out.